This is workshop 2, How to Avoid Lying with Visuals. So my name is Daria Task, and I am one of the co-organizers and moderators for this series, along with Dr. Joanna Konopka. We are both postdoctoral fellows at Johns Hopkins University and Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, respectively, in the departments of biology and neuroscience. And we are very pleased to present this workshop series to you in partnership with Project Bridge and the Johns Hopkins Doctoral Life Design Studio, and with the very generous sponsorship of the Kavli Neuroscience Discovery Institute and the Solomon H. Snyder Department of Neuroscience at Hopkins. So thank you very much to them for providing the funding for this series. So now I would like to cede the floor to our wonderful speaker, Dr. Barrett Klein, who is not only a scientist, but an accomplished artist and illustrator and visual science communicator, and the lead for the workshop series. So Barrett, take it away.
I am so excited, delighted, vivified, honored, and humbled to be here. And I deeply thank Daria and Joanna, especially for inviting me and for running the show. So this would not have been at all possible without both of them and the lovely folks at Johns Hopkins. So I've got a lot planned, kind of an ambitious schedule. Let's dive in. I'll share my screen. So as Daria mentioned, we had an overview of scientific visualization, as well as tried our hands at different graphical means of rendering visuals. The next one will be with Danielle Van Brabant, and I'm super excited about that because it's a realm that I have never trodden upon in my life, and that's medical animation, and it's a very valuable component to this series. November 14th, with my great friend Damon Kylo. He'll be coming from Cuba to spend a day, and we'll overlap in person, probably in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And that will be focused on reaching a broad audience or creating scientific visuals for others. November 21st, with my friend Amy Zhang, and that will be creating a logo. And finally, for the curious and or the hardcore, I'd like to run a special workshop on scientific visualization challenges. All right. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. I ride this intersection between science and art. I grew up in a family of artists, and I like to see how visuals can be depicted or conveyed, both with accuracy, clarity, and aesthetics in mind. I was delighted to go through the chats that we had from our last session, and there are a few standout questions and thoughts that I wanted to share at the outset. The first, from one participant, was very grateful that you provide this course for free. In Latin America, we rarely have these opportunities. This warmed my heart because a big impetus for me to hold this was to reach a large audience and not to have any kind of paywall, no financial prohibitive walls. And Daria just told me that 44% of our registrants are from the US, and the second place is from across India. And that is such a different time zone that I'm keeping you up late, and I'm excited to be here with you. One of the questions I'd like to address, can we follow a scientific illustration journey if we are professional visual artists, or would we have to specialize on a science field first? And this is a really great question because I know people who are artists without science training who do art for scientists. I know scientists who create visuals specifically and explicitly for their science and sometimes for other science without an artistic background. There is no pat answer to this, but I can tell you my personal experience growing up in love with insects and also in love with art. I wanted to explore both. And it was a challenge for me to decide which to pursue at the college level. And I finally decided to go for entomology, but to take as many art classes as I could as an undergraduate. And after graduating, I wanted to take some time to explore this intersection between science and art before going to grad school, which I knew I wanted to do in science. And I explored first possible avenues in natural history museums and special effects studios and all kinds of things. Well, I ended up working at an amazing exhibitory studio, Chase Studio in Missouri, and then following that up at the American Museum of Natural History, and then going to grad school in entomology. But it was not a clear, easy, linear path. And I found that when I applied to, for example, Chase Studio, I was met with the challenge that I was too much the scholar and not enough the artist. And so I had to prove myself to the point where the head of the studio, Terry Chase, realized the value of having that biology background. And then after the American Museum of Natural History, and I thought about doing work as an entomologist at the grad level as a master's PhD, then I was too much the artist and not enough the scientist. So I had to prove myself there in order to pave that path. And they, as well as I, found that there was great value in bringing art to the science. So it's been a really fun, enjoyable, challenging road, but maybe not the clearest, maybe not the most conventional. So yes, it can help to have, for example, a biology background if you wish to be a biology illustrator, but it's not absolutely necessary. I would say that if you're going to pursue such a road, you'd want to do your own training, rigorous training in biology. And we can talk about that one-on-one if you like. The next question, what if I cannot afford to be an artist? Well, that's a great question. My mom's a full-time artist, and it hasn't been super easy for her. There are a lot of ways to address this question as well. I already shared my path up to being jumping over some gaps to being a professor. Now, I'm an entomologist, an animal behavior biologist at a university as a professor. And art complements that. I do art on the side. So I am not a professional artist around the clock. And so I don't have to pay the bills from the art side. But that's the route that I love. I love the route of being a scientist and complementing that with art. This would be a great opportunity in the chat for people to share their personal stories, as well as say their pursuits in being a successful artist, which again can take many, many different forms. It doesn't cost a penny to be an artist. For example, to do earthworks outside, you don't need materials that cost a penny. But in order to support yourself in art as an artist, do you want to be a so-called fine artist? Do you want to be a scientific illustrator? And last time we talked about resources, for example, through the Guild for Natural Science Illustrators that help pave the path for those interested in that profession. Can you post the list of resources and list of book recommendations? You bet. In fact, I think Daria and Joanna have already done so. So we've got a list of links and things. It's not comprehensive by any stretch, but I compiled the first half, and Danielle Van Brabant generously offered a list relevant to medical illustrators and animators? And finally, are there academic departments that live at the intersection of science and art? Well, they're not incredibly common, and some fade away, but they do exist. So here's a collection of some. And note that SEISMA and Leonardo, these are journals. These are magazines and journals that publish on that intersection of science and art. Here's a defunct one, ASCII, but it has full archives to explore. And then there are others like Symbiotica in Australia that create a venue, an opportunity in an attempt in a real way to forge collaborations between artists and scientists. And some of these are listed in our resource list. Okay, now jumping into visualizing science, I'm going to give the 2-minute overview of what we did last time, especially for those who didn't come, but it's always nice to have at least a refresher. I talked about guidelines, not rules, but guidelines when illustrating, and especially when illustrating something like an insect. The first is to observe your subject. That means really paying attention to the subject you wish to visually depict. So know what structures or movements to look for, identify them in your specimen before picking up that pencil. And then clearly depicting what you see. Now, today we'll talk about artistic license and bending the truth this way and that, when it's acceptable, when it's advisable, when it's taboo. If you have a canvas, whatever it is, a football field, a tiny sheet of paper, you want to optimize your scale, thinking about what the end product is or what your goal is. So for example, if you want to create a publishable figure, think about how the size will be ultimately in that publication. Is it a raster-based tangible illustration on paper? Is it meant to be a digital visual that can be infinitely expanded? Should it be a vector-based illustration? Oftentimes, it helps to include a scale bar. How large is that insect? And finally, sometimes visuals can stand on their own, but often complementing them with text, for example, in your traditional figure legend below a figure, can be necessary. So I went over examples of how you might illustrate the dorsal view of a bilaterally symmetrical animal, like this paper wasp. And you see it's a little bit damaged. Our right hand hind wing there is a little bit damaged, but I might measure it. And if you're doing a technical illustration, and not just a doodle or a sketch or a rough drawing, but a technical illustration, one way you can approach this, especially if you're dealing with a bilaterally symmetrical view of an organism, is to draw a quick line down the center and then take those careful measurements. Maybe it's the length of the whole body from head to the tip of the abdomen, and then finer measurements along the body axis. Then you can measure widths, half. So take that width of the thorax, of the midsection of the body, and maybe you take half that measurement to the left, half that measurement to the right, and do a number of them, 1,000,000 of them, and you've done a pointillist work and you're done with your illustration. Or you do more of an organic drawing around those measurements you've created, a finer, harder drawing, and maybe the ink, if you're doing it in ink. And we talked about the scale bar and scaling up from your subject or down from your subject if you're rendering something that's huge to a small canvas, and then trying to depict how large that is based on a little line segment. Maybe you point out anatomical features in the process. This ends up being a clean line drawing, but we made a bilaterally symmetrical bisected illustration where half of it was three-dimensional. You could do that in color. You could do that with stippling or hash marks in your illustration, depending on your goals.
Maybe Bear, you can answer a question in the chat or in the Q&A. Daria wants to read it out for you, and I'll set up the poll.
Oh, sure.
If you don't have a specimen of a subject to work from, nor one's own image, are there concerns to take into account when using an image you find online for our illustrations? For example, is there a thought of plagiarism?
Absolutely. That's a very serious question with many implications. You will want to cite your source always, depending to what extent you alter or modify that source. Gaining permissions can be key, but that's only one facet to address your question. Another is, can you trust your source material? There's a lot of artificial intelligence hooey out there, as well as visuals taken from maybe less authoritative sources. But if you trust your source, for example, and it's a beautiful image of your source, I would say there are limits to the application of using a two-dimensional reference versus having your three-dimensional subject at hand. So for example, you lose aspects of stereoscopy, visual occlusion, other helpful parameters for rendering a three-dimensional subject. So when I teach my animal behavior class or I teach scientific visualization class, we run outside and we do sketches for a day drawing from nature. And I find that to be really important because if you take a video of a subject, that video has been edited in some way, whether it be in terms of the cropping by the videographer, whether it means post-process editing, cropped, for example. Maybe it was modified in terms of saturation, etc. So the information content is minimized, is bowdlerized, is to some extent potentially censored. Using your own perceptual modalities, say vision, for example, you don't face the same limitations. Also, what others produce may not be what you intend to project or to share. A lot of different ways to address that question, and I'd love to pursue that more if we have time later. So here we are with how to avoid lying with visuals. And I'll return to what I think is a really important page of Edward Tufte's classic book, The Visual Display of Quantitative Information. And the principles he suggests are important for creating a work of graphical excellence. I'm going to skip down to my favorite line. Graphical excellence is that which gives to the viewer the greatest number of ideas in the shortest time with the least ink in the smallest space. And his favorite image here by Charles Minard we'll share in a moment. Graphical excellence is nearly always multivariate. And here in this visual, there are actually 6 layers of information. And today, the primary focus will be this last criterion by Tufte. And graphical excellence requires telling the truth about the data. So let's forge forth and tell the truth together. All right, here's Gwangi from the Valley of Gwangi, a 1969 film. And yeah, there is no way that dinosaur is running around and chomping on real humans, right? This is a case where Ray Harryhausen, the now sadly deceased master of stop motion animation, taking a puppet that has an armature that he can modify frame by frame with celluloid film and then overlay or superimpose on film of humans, did a lot with dinosaurs as well as mythical creatures. So Ray Harryhausen said, I love this part, I found dinosaurs to be the ideal subject for stop motion animation. The fact that nobody knew how those huge reptiles had moved, or for that matter, exactly how they looked, meant that I could bring them alive without any fear of criticism. Now, if you think about how dinosaurs are portrayed today in natural history museums or in books, it's very different than, say, 20 years ago. We now have a much better idea of how T-Rex bounded about more horizontal than vertical, not a lumbering giant, but a warm-blooded, potentially feather-filled theropod. So where can scientific visualization go awry? And I'm going to pick on Ernst Haeckel, who was a giant, not only in science, but visualizing science. Some of the greatest, most exquisite images from radiolarians to cnidarians are from Ernst Haeckel. Well, he also committed scandalous visualization errors in the case of, and here's a famous phrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Now, to some extent, you can look at ontogeny, or the development of organisms, and recapitulate or rebuild from that knowledge phylogeny, or evolutionary relatedness of organisms. So he looked at embryology, the development of, and here are a variety of vertebrates, and how strangely and non-coincidentally similar they are at the earliest stages of development. Well, you don't need to modify that. You don't need to exaggerate that to show that, to some extent, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, that development shows how similar we are, humans to pigs to chicks. But unfortunately, Ernst Haeckel did, and that has been controversial ever since. Now, when Charles Darwin published his only illustration in On the Origin of Species, his classic tome from 1859, it was a phylogenetic tree of life, a hypothetical diagram of relatedness, a visual metaphor in the form of a tree. Ernst Haeckel loved this, and he went crazy, he lost sleep over creating tree after tree after tree, some of them quite literal, like this one. I'll be curious, maybe in the chat, someone can respond, what's problematic? Maybe one or two items that's problematic with an otherwise beautiful tree, potentially showing phylogenetic associations or evolutionary relationships.
So it says humans are on top, too much text. It's based on morphology, implies that there's a base and you continue to evolve, implies a hierarchy.
Oh, this is great. This is perfect. I love it.
It's not the relationship between species is not systematic, the width and the
Yeah, you guys are on the ball. So all of those are spot on. I'll add to this a little bit and maybe embellish. For example, this tree that you see, yeah, there's a thick trunk that goes to these piddly little branches, the twigs, and you'll notice that most of the information content is embedded in this trunk, right? Which means it doesn't give us information about the branching, the evolutionary relatedness. What are the most recent common ancestors, right? And some mention that, and maybe this is a person who can read German, Menschen is at the top of the tree, man or humans. Well, this is utterly arbitrary. You take a phylogenetic tree, and let's say you have two branches. The most recent common ancestor at the base of those branches can be swiveled, and it's totally arbitrary as to whether you have A here and B there, or B here and A there, because you swivel that node and the tree is meaningful. The only thing you look for in a phylogenetic tree typically is shared common ancestry. Does it retain the information across this version of a tree versus that version of a tree, right? So yes, we could keep going on and on and on with this one. I'll leave it there and move on to our next graphic. And this is by my mom. So of course, people in the chat, you'll have nothing to say but very positive things, accolades about this beautiful graphic that my mother has produced for a book I'm working on with Niels Rattenborg and John Lesku on sleep across the animal kingdom. In this particular case, though, I want to point out that there are exaggerations, right? This is not an accurate illustration. We didn't ask for an accurate illustration, and we didn't need an accurate illustration to convey a concept, to tell a story. In this case, if you tried to depict perfectly accurately the story of a single species of fish, which can have a population of cave-dwelling, blind, pale fish that behave differently, namely they're awake more often, they sleep less than those above ground, you'd probably lose the detail that's necessary. So here's a composite that forces the two giant fish together in tiny bodies of water in a visual that lies appropriately to tell a story. And this will be a common theme. When is it okay to distort from reality? The next one, yes, is a little bit gratuitous because it's also by my mom, and we finished it yesterday. So this is hot off the presses. Well, it's not even on the presses yet, but it includes a vampire bat. Wait, I'm not going to say anymore. The chat, tell me what you see in this visual. I want to know if this is clear enough to the world, even without the figure legend.
So the first response so far is bat flies.
Oh, good. Now, what family of bat fly?
And then somebody says maybe fleas, potential parasite on a bat, then a parasite on a parasite, transmission of disease, parasite, hyperparasitism.
This is great. People are reading it properly, which means this is somewhat successful. Yes, you're looking at a fungal parasite of a streblid bat fly that sucks the blood of a vampire bat, Desmodus rotundus, that's sucking the blood of some mystery ungulate. So a parasite of a parasite of a parasite. Spot on. Now, my mother and I have taken liberties with this illustration, right? But we've used perceptual biases that at least many of the participants are used to, are familiar enough with, that you could read this, not as a giant weird organ or finger in the universe floating above on this gargantuan fly, but rather that they're scaled up. And no, you probably wouldn't see a big starry sky at ground level, but shows that it's at night and evokes emotions. Or at least I hope it does. Next, I showed this image last workshop, and it's appropriate here as well, because again, this is an HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, and other viruses and tiny organisms that if we hadn't blown up or magnified as these tangible sculptures in an exhibit epidemic at the American Museum of Natural History, you wouldn't have been able to see a 90 nanometer in diameter virus that is physically incapable of reflecting visible light, let alone the hues that we arbitrarily imposed upon these viruses. So here, there were design decisions that are impossible in nature to facilitate discriminability across the different subjects. Here's an image that's new to me as of this week from a gorgeous book called Fungi of Temperate Europe. And the authors made available for free a PDF called The Wheels. And this is just one of many wheels in which you can look at different scales, different information content that will help you determine what fungus you're looking at. So even in this beautiful array, you're going to find simplifications out of necessity. So what do you choose to depict? What do you choose to extract? Because this could easily become overwhelming. Okay. Now there's a whole lot to cover, and I'm going to skim the surface of a few huge topics. I saw in the chat before I turned this on that someone wants to teach their students about how to make better posters graphically. So we're going to touch on that first. And posters, slides in a talk or a presentation you might be giving have similar principles. And I'm just going to very briefly go over some of those ideas. And my hope is that a number of you have uploaded posters that you've created, or maybe slides from presentations you've created. And I'll give you an opportunity later in the session to upload those, and we can talk about the merits of those and critique them as well, because every graphic that anyone produces can always be improved. Bang Wang, what a hero in design and visualization. He did a whole series, I think there were 18 monthly contributions to Nature Methods, in which he gave a one-page overview on relevant topic after relevant topic to visualization. So here, I'd say layout of posters and talk slides is really relevant when it comes to his discussion about PowerPoints and layout in design. So for example, down here, you see a poster. And what is this suggesting? This is suggesting that there should be a logical progression where your eyes travel, whether it be in a poster or a slide. And some even refer to these as PowerPoints. So you see these 4 dots here. Well, there are basic mathematical principles that can be applied. And the golden section gives you the idea that X here, this line segment, is to X plus Y as Y is to X. So this can be broken down, more or less closely to that golden section, to the rule of thirds, right? And in this layout, you might travel across and down roughly to a third. And this tends to be where our eyes spend the most time. So why not exploit that? Take advantage of those so-called PowerPoints. And as Seurat did, or presumably, use that golden section to see where maybe you most productively could place your subject matter. Prepare thyself, because I'm going to show what I hope constitutes the worst slide you've ever seen. Years ago, I ran a number of visualization workshops in Germany, and I had students, as you are today, offering some graphics they thought were really successful, as well as those that were problematic. And in one case, my student gave a slide from one of his lecturer's slides from that week. And here it comes. In the chat, share with me some thoughts about why your brain is spiraling and swirling if you haven't already collapsed to the floor in a fit.
Somebody's response is literally just all caps, my eyes. Too many colors, too many words. Oh, they're coming in so fast. No focus, too many colors, no hierarchy, just text. Where's the picture?
Right?
There's so much going on.
There is, let's leave it at that. There is so much going on, and you are absolutely right. There is no breathing room on this slide. There's something to be said for allowing for negative space. A little bit of margin on the left and right, top and bottom, space in between, so that we have a little bit of, breathing room, right? Then there's the question of size. Like you take your text, and there are all kinds of sizes there. What's more important? And then there's the question of font and typeface. So typeface, like Arial versus Helvetica, Times New Roman, like what typeface are you choosing? Are you making it bold or italicizing it? That's the font. We've got a lot of going on here in the form of typefaces, in the form of fonts and colors and underlines. And so I don't know what to do here. It doesn't matter that now some of our audience is German. Pretend it's in a language that isn't your first. Even if you don't understand the language here, you know already that this is overwhelming in a bad way. You could tell a message about biodiversity and fill your slide with organisms. That's overwhelming in a good way. In this case, there's no stepwise progression. There's no uniformity. There's no linearity. There's no context. There's no breathability. And so all of these factors render this slide problematic. How about this one?
Oh,
Even Joanna was struck back by this one. Problem?
bad colors. Wow, horrible contrast, unreadable.
Yeah.
I've been blinded. Wow.
That's right. That person was blinded. It's illegible. Poor color choice. The contrast is off. Our brains can't pull this red scarlet on one end, and you could choose green, you could choose blue, and it tends to cause kind of a vibratory effect.
And also people are mentioning about color blindness, which is very
Exactly. Thank you. So we'll talk a little bit more about color blindness. The most common is red-green color blindness. And if you're from Scandinavian descent, the likelihood is that 8% of you, if you're male, typically male, suffer from congenital red-green color blindness. So let's get rid of color. Do we have the perfect slide now?
No.
Okay, so what do we need here if this is
I guess
not
so.
the perfect slide?
Boring slide.
So boring. So very boring.
Underwhelming. Need to too many words.
Yes, thank you. So
Typos.
let's focus on those. So you're right, there are too many words. It's a boring slide, maybe a visual, a relevant, not a gratuitous, but a relevant visual that's aesthetically compelling would operate well here. So let's see, too many words, too much text. If you're there to complement and guide your audience through this topic, through the subject matter with this material, then you can cover it. You don't have to compete with the information here. So let's trim the words. Ta-da! Now we've got our perfect slide, right?
Images, please.
Yeah, several of the reasons you suggested, this is still suboptimal. Now, some people suggest a 5x5 rule. I wouldn't call it a rule, but the idea is don't try to compile more than 5 things on your slide and 5 words within each of those 5 things. Well, I wouldn't say that's a hard and fast rule by any stretch, but as a guide to try to skip the text that's extraneous, that's superfluous, might benefit you, certainly might benefit your audience. How about this one? So I whipped this one up yesterday where I went to Wikimedia Commons and I found a freely available image that's relevant, a fungal image, by Holger Crisp. I cite him, I include this image, and I give a background that's not too stark, black on white, but something that might be easier on the eyes. We know because of this color that we're dealing with some major topic of fungal characteristics, and here they are. I didn't change the text at all, but the complement here is not just a fungus floating on a white background, but I can use the plants surrounding it as a means of comparing and contrasting, because 150, or let's just say hundreds of years ago, people plopped fungi with plants, saying they're more closely related than either one is to animals, which is a farce because animals share a more recent common ancestor with fungi. We're both opisthecons, which means primitively we have a backwards facing tail. Think of a sperm in a human. And plants don't have that. Plants have very different things. I'm not saying this is a perfect slide, but maybe in this stepwise fashion, we're approaching something that is more accessible, as well as exhilarating, inspiring to your audience. I'm moving from slides and posters, although I'd love to return to that when we critique examples, because I want to invest time on graphs and charts. And what am I going to start with? Of course, predictably, I'm going to start with Charles Minard's classic work from 1869, the statistician who produced Edward Tufte's favorite. And again, this is Napoleon's army marching on Moscow, and then in a miserable defeat, returning in only a sliver of the number that began. So there's a lot here, 6 layers of information. So it's over time, it's over geography, crossing rivers, the number of soldiers, et cetera, et cetera. It's packed with information, but I would argue that it's not overwhelming. So this is what Edward Tufte referred to as multivariate. So there are multiple variables embedded within a single graphic. Here's a graphic that I helped to create for an article by Ryan Taylor et al. In 2017. And I'm not going to inundate you with information about the study, but Joey Stein and I created robotic frogs, and a robo-frog can be used to address questions that would otherwise be impossible in nature. So you take a robo-frog and you can address questions relating to sexual selection or mate selection. How is a female tundra frog selecting a male? Well, the tundra frog can call with a complex call, right? In this case, a whine chuck, or just a whine. The whine chuck is always better than the whine. But how do visuals play a role? Throw in the robotic frog. In this case, and then inflate that vocal sac, whine chuck, and then, well, that's not synchronous. The female's not going to face that in nature, so she does not like that bar low relative to just the whine chuck without any visual, much higher. So you can go across and make those comparisons. And then the robo versus, right? How about, and this is where I think the visual, the schematic, the simplified frog visual can really play a role in making this accessible and clarifying matters. I flipped it. So now that extending vocal sac here precedes the whine chuck. So you have inflation, deflation. Well, the female does not like that at all relative to the. So synchrony seems to be important. Now, the bottom line here is I'm trying to show that maybe an XY plot complemented with visuals that are used elsewhere in the publication could help augment the story and clarify the message. Here's an unusual graph I wanted to show based on order: beetles, Coleoptera; moths and butterflies, Lepidoptera; true flies, Diptera; bees, wasps, ants, and sawflies, Hymenoptera, etc., all the way to Zooptera, the angel insects that even most entomologists have never heard of. Okay, how many of them exist? On this scale, you have the number of identified insect species. So this is the number of scientifically described species on the planet, times 1,000. So 400,000 plus species of beetles versus Lepidoptera, da, 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 da. Now compare that to the number of insect artworks. So artists using insects as their muse for various reasons. And what one message jumps out in this graphic?
People are saying bias. Hymenoptera will represent.
Yes. Bing! So what's exploding out of here? Hymenoptera over everything else. Sure, there are lots of described species of Hymenoptera, but not more than beetles so far. This is the bias, and you pulled out that message despite the fact that I deviated from a more traditional approach of having Hymenoptera bar by Hymenoptera bar. I could have had two y-axes where I have the number of described species as well as the number of times these insects have been depicted in art. Two different y scales, and then Hymenoptera by Hymenoptera. But here I was hoping that readers would see, is this a mirror image? No, it is not. This is with Tierney Brocious from an article about how artists depict insects, choose them as their muses in order to explore ideas of how humans are destroying the living planet in various ways. This single graphic, I declare, I proclaim, depicts all of art. So any art piece you could ever create or find in the universe could be put in this A, B, C, D, E, or F, okay? So now I'm giving a bias. I'm really focusing on insects. And I can say, are insects depicted in the art? Well, in this case, yeah, explicitly, there's a dragonfly. And yeah, there's Albrecht Dürer's stag beetle. So yeah, explicitly. Yes, though conceptually, here's Marlene Huissu's work that features honeybee propolis in the art. And here, these are monks that have stolen Bombyx mori silkworm moth immatures and transported it so that the emperor could take it on as the new silk-producing empire. Sericulture reigned, and it changed the economy of Europe based on this theft. So yeah, it's implicit or conceptually there. What if insects are not depicted? Okay, here they're not depicted. I don't see any insects. I don't see any insects. And no, they're not conceptually in either one. Okay, but why the red box? This is the focus of the review article. What was an insect medium used? Did you use cochineal? Did you use lac? Did you use honey, beeswax, silk? In this case, no. And in this little quadrant here, this represents no insects involved in any way that I know about or that I can tell. But here, yeah, there are at least three insect species involved here in the silk and the cochineal and the lac as dyes. Moving on to a famous graphic by Rudiger Wehner. So here is your phenomenal behavioral biologist who published the book, The Desert Navigator, in 2020. And in it, you see this ant. This genus of ant, Cataglyphus, lives in, for example, Tunisia. And it can be hot there in the desert, really hot. So hot that some individuals, like one species of Cataglyphus, will explosively erupt from their nest entrance for a very short span of time at the hottest time of the day. That's deadly. But they're doing it between a time I'm going to risk death, but I'm going to avoid being eaten by a specialist, a lizard that will consume ants. Even this ant can't survive forever in this heat. So let's say this N represents their nest. And an individual, a solo effort, this Cataglyphus desert ant is running around, and she only has 4.5 minutes before she perishes due to the heat. Let's say it takes her 3 minutes to get all the way to this dead beetle on the sand. Well, if she left a trail pheromone and it took at least that much time because she's dragging a beetle to go back, she'd be dead about here, right? 4.5 minutes. Instead, remarkably, and this graphic abstractly shows on a grid, that she, through dead reckoning and through monitoring her own tarsal steps, she can make her way back in more or less a straight line, a beeline, or an ant line. That's what this graphic shows. And we could ask, all right, is that the perfect graphic? This was published in a book, and color helps in a book, but it was originally published in black and white, and maybe that's enough. Maybe color isn't necessary here to tell the same story. Is color distracting, or is it enhancing? Continuing with Rudiger Weiner et al., this is a story where Cataglyphus bicolor, and if you read the x-axis, this is over across the day, and if you read the y-axis, absolute number of exiting ants, well, you have somewhat of a bell curve. More ants are coming out later in the morning, and then it goes down in the evening. But what if we take this Cataglyphus species, shebang, right here in the middle of the day, the heat of the day, within a span of, what is that, like 14 minutes or so? Pew! They explode out. So very brief period. This graph is, in my mind, pretty evocative, even without an image, because it's contrasting these two very different species-specific approaches. If we look at the x-axis, however, or the y-axis here, you see that's only 4 ants. And here, 160 ants. So the scales are very different. And the reader had best look at that carefully in order to be able to extract that information. Chat, tell me when a pie chart is useful.
Rarely, never. When there's 100%. Proportions, ratios, percentages, not sure if that's useful. When the numbers don't matter, quick overview of different proportions.
Hey, these are great responses. All of them were excellent responses. You can see that the URL ends with worst graphs here. That's just because this particular graphic, according to those who produce this website, didn't find it particularly appealing. But we'll talk about pie charts. One person, at least one person, was spot on when they talked about if there's 100%. Another person said proportions or percentages. That's key. So what if I asked you, actually, everybody out there, pull out a scratch piece of paper, draw a circle, and draw a pie chart that's meaningful to you. Doesn't have to be exact, just something that depicts proportional or percentage data that's meaningful to you.
So one comment in the chat as we're waiting, somebody said that people are bad at seeing radio comparisons, which I think is a very good point.
Very good. That's right. Looking at curvilinear and area-based wedges, we'll talk about both of those things. Some of you have created your pie charts. Does anyone in the chat want to give just a brief blurb of what their pie chart depicts?
A pie chart of analog clock, 24 hours, and how I spend my day.
Ah, very good. I love it. That's actually brilliant. You can now imagine this clock. And now, granted, we only have the 12 hours when they're really 24 hours, but you can think about the wedges in this pie chart devoted to doing your homework, practicing your musical instrument, right? Sleeping, or trying to sleep, attending a scientific visualization workshop, right? Great. What's another one?
Pie eaten versus pie not eaten.
That is the most literal pie chart you could possibly imagine. That's brilliant. Good. And that's spot on because you're talking about reality. You're talking about real numbers, real proportions. How about one more?
A pie chart contrasting distribution of time between teaching, research, and service, expectation versus reality.
Oh my gosh. So you're going to have a side-by-side comparison of two pie charts and see how one is utterly and fantabulously fictive and concocted by someone other than you. So when I took my job as a university professor at UWL, University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, service was said to be about 10% and research maybe 30%. Is it really? You see that pie charts have limited value. I won't say, as someone did in the chat, they're never useful. We'll talk about that. Maybe they can be useful. I'll give you an example of where they are not correctly applied and at least more correctly applied. If I want to create a pie chart of the diversity of life on the planet, and I choose, at the simplest, I'd say eukarya and non-eukaryote archaeans and non-archaean bacteria. Create a pie chart with 3 wedges. Is that okay? Why wouldn't that pie chart be okay?
Waiting for answers.
I did not include a really key qualifier. I want to create a pie chart of all life, life's diversity.
So people are saying, what are the units? Somebody's saying, what is the unit?
May not matter.
What
Right? Because if you're thinking proportion, it may not matter.
Somebody's asking, is it for all life that is discovered, or like all life?
Wow, that's it, right? That's not 100%. That's not 1.0. I can't do percentage or proportion of unknowns, because some have suggested that there may be as many as 1 trillion species, most of which are bacteria. What? Versus the presently described like just under 2 million species. Who knows? But if I use just that one qualifier of scientifically described species, now we're getting somewhere. Now I could show a pie chart. Now that's a separate question then. Is that the best way to compare the data? Now I'm going to ask the next question has to do with, when is it advisable to depict your data as a 3D pie chart? And yes, I did a Google search for 3D pie chart, and this is one of the first things that came up. You can invest your monies into a template to create your very own glossy, shimmery 3D pie chart.
So the answers are
Tempted? Tempted?
never or no with many O's. And
That's right. Thank you for those multiple O's
yes.
and the multiple exclamation marks, because you can't see me, I don't think, throw something at the screen, because yes, the answer is never. Now, here's a more difficult question. Why never?
There's many comments coming in. 2D is sufficient, occludes some
Ah.
portions of the graph,
That's
confusing
perfect right there.
proportions.
Just saying is sufficient. 2D is sufficient. That's the bottom line. So we're looking at dimensionality of data. If you can tell your story with one dimension, a line segment, maybe that's enough. If you have two-dimensional data and you have X, Y, you're talking about area. Maybe sometimes that's enough. 3D, do you need the Z component, X, Y, and Z? And we can talk about times or ways that you can. But in this case, just as some implied in the responses to the 2D pie chart being unnecessary because you've got linear data, you've got one-dimensional data. Each of those pie wedges could be reflected by line segments, all lined up. Is that taller than the other? It's more difficult for us to discern areas potentially. Okay, so if I go to this next glossy one to these, again, this is from the worst graphs. So you know that this is probably, at least in some people's biased opinions, problematic. Well, this is not only a 3D pie chart, but look at the angle. How can I compare that versus that versus that? I can't in any really useful way. So it's a useless, it's less than useless. It's traumatizing. That's right. It's problematic. It'll not only distract you with lack of clarity, but it'll misguide you. And that's the last thing we want to do with our visuals. Similarly, this is one-dimensional data and now shown three-dimensionally, problematically. Bang Wang to the rescue once again. Here, we're going to look at, actually, before we do, pop poll, Daria. You ready? See these different measures at the bottom. We've got hues. We've got color saturation, volumes, areas, angles, lengths, positions with a set scale, like it's all lined up. Of those 8, which would you say in your pop poll is the #1 clearest, easiest graph to discern the different values?
So we have a backlog of questions. Should we use Creative Commons license for illustrations? I think this goes back to the plagiarism question.
Yeah, this overlaps with that question in really important and interesting ways, because yes, in the sense that they are freely available, there are no restrictions for use as long as you cite the sources properly. But should you is the question. And then it gets at deeper questions of, are they showing accurately, clearly, optimally, aesthetically, what you wish to portray, what you wish to convey? For my book, The Insect Epiphany, I did use 2 images that were available through Wikimedia Commons because they were exceptional. They were beautiful. They told the story I needed to tell in a photograph, for example. So there are times and there are places. If you have any doubt that they're Bowdlerized, modified inappropriately, if you have any doubt in terms of the veracity or the integrity of the source, then do not. If you can validate the source to the extreme, terrific. And that's what I typically demand of myself or try to achieve, and that is to find the source without assuming that it's a viable source.
Ooh, what measures to take for making images accessible to people with low or no vision? That's a tricky one.
I had an email exchange with a really great scientist who's blind. Because I'm so visually oriented, I was curious as to how he conducted his evolution research with snails. And for him, the perceptual modality of choice is touch, tactile sensation. So there are ways, because our audience is biased toward visual depictions, there are ways to translate, for example, audio information into visuals, from tactile information to visuals. It can be tricky, but it can be successful if handled well. If you can't see well or at all, maybe there are people out there who could respond with greater experience, maybe even personal experience, where I cannot. But of course, there are tools available to people who are blind from Braille on that can help. And I was looking at a graphic yesterday for a book for the blind, and I wondered about the value of the cover. And I wondered if the cover was flat. Was it two-dimensional? Because in that particular example, the intended audience could potentially benefit from raised components on that cover.
Someone mentions that 3D printing can be a useful tool in this
Oh,
case.
good point. So that's a wonderful point. There have been so many terrific, like protein folding to anatomy in the neck of Apis mellifera honeybee papers out there that render things three-dimensionally, some of which probably provide freely available data to download three-dimensional printing options. So wouldn't it be wonderful if in the case of three-dimensional data, you're offered in the supplementary materials, for example, a link to download the three-dimensional figure that you could then print three-dimensionally and then touch. That'd be kind of brilliant. Oh, this is really interesting and not exactly what I would have expected. Position rules the day. And color is pretty high up there, and length is pretty high up there. Well, this is good. Okay, this is really good. Volume, we'll see, is a bit of a surprise. So I'm going to move this over here, and I'm going to hit the results. And these results, Bang Wang published, but they're adapted from Cleveland and McGill, a classic paper from 1983. Cleveland and McGill were one of the first to try to quantify across these different approaches to visualizing data, removing as much bias as possible, how they ranked. And you see that position, yeah, is the highest, just as you guys suggested. And moreover, it's specifically positioned with a uniform scale or a common scale. And then positions on the same but not aligned, that's pretty tricky. I mean, I'm grateful that there's this little notch here to help me see if it's before or after, but then it gets a little bit hairy trying to compare these very well. But it's still good. The next one, according to Cleveland and McGill's study, is lengths. Now, this would be especially great if this were on a common scale. It gets a little bit tough to compare the lengths, or if you turned it, the height, unless similar ones are side by side. So in that way, it's not the best. Angles, slopes are the next one. Area, wow, now it's getting really tricky. Like look at these areas up here. This little circle and this big circle. Anybody guess how many times bigger this one is than that one? Chat.
A lot?
Give me two of them.
16, 5.
Okay, ranges from 16 to 5 times. That's pretty telling right there. This is actually 14 times the area of that. So you saw the range in just those two responses. Yikes, area might not be so helpful. Volume. Wow, this is horrible. I don't know how you'd get the three-dimensional volumetric data comparing this versus that accurately. So even relative is difficult to gauge here. And according to this, color saturation is as difficult, and that's right here, as volume. And then color hue can potentially be the worst. Well, that's not what you guys were suggesting up here. And maybe it's because color is so valuable and so important for discriminating data. So let's talk about this discriminability and bias that are both embedded within, and I'm going to kill this poll too, embedded within color. First, not only was it difficult here in this graphic to compare these relative areas, but look at these curvilinear lines, this XY plot. We use these all the time, right? Scientists tend to use these a lot, but it's really hard to tell that the disparity between these two curves is the same all the way, right? Just follow that y-axis and you see that this disparity is the same as that disparity. Hard for our brains to conceive of that. So maybe that's not the best graphic at all times. Likewise, look at this plot. So you've got our pie chart, A through E here, and it might be pretty difficult to distinguish B from E here, or B from A, or some of these, right? A from D. Well, all these are linear data. So now let's plot the same data on this XY graph, and now you can easily compare B and E when I found it very difficult to compare the areas there. Or as someone in the chat mentioned, this curvilinear line segment. Now, the curvilinear line segment and the area, these are meaningful data. It's just hard for our brains to process them. Color. Problem and the beauty of color. So color, when we think about color in publishing or creating our figures, our graphics, we're actually dealing with three parameters here. True color involves hue. And are you going from yellow to blue here? That's hue. Are you brightening it or lightening it? And then what happens with saturation? You can work with all of these in a color wheel, and you see that in image manipulation programs like Adobe Photoshop and GIMP and Adobe Illustrator and Inkscape, you've got this capacity. In the Adobe products, they're made as a square, but the same idea is there. You spin around, right? And you can play with these three parameters, these three values, hue, brightness, and saturation. And if you do that, you can find that grayscale has more visibility as you shift around one or more of those values. So you can play with not just hue, but brightness and saturation in order to be able to discriminate across these values. Beng Wang also shows in an article about color, and you can see this with optical illusions. I could have chosen 1,001 amazing examples, including memes that can fool us. Is that dress gold or is it blue? But in this graphic, this is really clearly shown that, okay, here you've got these little bars are the same, they're the identical hue. But here, check them out. Hard to see them as the same hue. And how about these? They can look very similar, depending on context. Put them together and we can discriminate them easily. The two bars here with the asterisk, identical. Context matters. We can be fooled by hues just based on the context, their surroundings. So I say below that colors can really help you discriminate across different subjects or different data, but color is relative. So it can bias our visual perception. So just be very mindful of that. And then there's this. You know, it'd be fun to do a little pop poll. So who can read the number here and who cannot? And again, about 8% of those of Scandinavian descent and are male suffer from this particular color blindness. About 0.5% are female do. This is one type of color blindness, and embedded in image manipulation programs like Photoshop, you can test your images for different types of color blindness to see the discriminability factor, say, if your image is still discernible. Or do you need to tweak saturation or brightness? Interesting. So 4% may be red-green colorblind. Fascinating, right? We could tweak this and you 3% would be able to discern that it's the answer to the life, universe, and everything, the number 42.
So there's quite a few questions, and you can maybe pick out the one that you think is most relevant right now or most interesting about.
Sure. Right now, let's see. There's a question from Stacy Cote. What software or programs are you using to create these types of graphs? So I created only a couple of the graphs that I showed and some of the images that I've shared. And what I typically use is Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Illustrator. And the free versions of those are aplenty, including GIMP and Inkscape. And in terms of graphing, there are all kinds of programs out there. And honestly, you can do beautiful things in R if you're R savvy. But you can make things like Microsoft Excel and open source versions comparable to that work beautifully for you. You can also modify them and make them more aesthetically compelling by pulling them into programs like Illustrator, as long as you don't deviate from the data, as long as you don't manipulate the representation of the data egregiously. But people in the chat, I'm sure, will have plenty of program suggestions to offer. How do you get commissioned to illustrate for scientific papers? For me right now, I might be asked and I might pass the requests along to others due to lack of time, but if it's an exciting project to me, I jump on it. And for me, it's a lot of word of mouth. But if you're starting up or starting a business, for example, if you want to be a freelancer, or if you want to try to find a permanent position, these are types of questions that I think might be better addressed when Damon Kylo and I collaborate on the future workshop together, and or when Danielle Van Brabant presents next time with medical animation. But a short answer is, if you use our links or go to the Guild for Natural Science Illustrators, they have so many wonderful resources online for pursuing what it means to be a professional scientific illustrator or medical illustrator, and how to go about doing everything from writing up a contract to what color pencils to use that are archival. This person has a really interesting comment. I had a supervisor who hated color on presentations. He thought it evokes unnecessary emotion and distraction while presenting neutral, informative science data. What is my thought about that? It seems most attendees here like, so color is a powerful tool, and just like any powerful tool, it can be used or abused. And I would not deprive an audience of color entirely if color is appropriately wielded for emotive or evocative gain. Now, as I mentioned, color can bias your perception. Sometimes the brightness of a red, depending on the context, can make you think something is differently sized. So we have to be careful with that. And one way to be careful is to adjust the saturation to the point where it's equal across. And you can test this through grayscale, for example. But again, if you're careful about color blindness issues and you accommodate for that, and you're aware that there are possibilities of biasing people's perceptions about how to interpret the data. I mean, your supervisor obviously didn't deal with color psychology where it'd be necessary to include color. So there are times where, for example, I want to show people how to discriminate species of fill in the blank, and color is an important or essential factor. Well, this point would be moot. So it's all relative. How do you decide how much information to include in a graphical abstract to make it understandable? Great question, Monica. And I think this is also context dependent, and I hope that people have uploaded abstracts, visual abstracts or graphical abstracts, so we can discuss and critique. So there's no easy answer without talking through a visual, but watch the amount of text, minimize it to the extreme. Also watch out for the number of components, visual components, minimize that to the essential extreme. Essentially, what you want to do, just as you want to do with a poster, is attract someone from across the room and keep them there. And how to do that depends on what vehicles and variables and mechanisms you're using and how you're wielding them. I know that's really vague. So again, I hope we can walk through examples. Everybody with me?
I think we're all good.
For this pie chart? Yes, indeed. A pie chart that I created. So, I must have found some strange embedded value in creating a pie chart. In my case, this may not be as literal as the pie chart that a participant created with how much pie they had eaten of the pie, what proportion of the pie they'd eaten, but it's meant to be a literal pie chart of the biodiversity of life. So if this represents all of described species on the planet.
Sorry, Barrett, but we see a moth. We don't see a pie chart.
Oh, this is a moth. And do you see a leaf for a plant here?
Yes. Oh, this is the pie chart.
This is the pie chart. And so the idea of being a literal pie chart, and this was an aqua tint, a copper etching, and I superimposed a drawing I had done of a Madagascar moth and some color. So the idea here is, okay, if this represents, this wedge of a whole circle represents the proportion of species that are described on Earth, representing insects, and this arachnids, non-insect crustaceans, mollusks, plants, fungi, etc., how accurate is it? And what I'd like to do is return to this pie chart to test it in a quantifiable way. But let's get there. Here's a page or a graph that Edward Tufte published in Visual Display of Quantitative Information. And it doesn't really matter what it's about, but let's say commission payments to travel agents for each of these 4 airlines. Okay, so United Airlines, how much was that travel agent paid this year versus that year versus boo? Look at that. It's a pretty easy takeaway. Or is it? Chat, what problem exists with this graph?
Somebody saying, is the third dimension necessary?
Answer, no. So that's one problem, correct.
Only half of 1978 color would help.
Bing! Look at that.
First,
That is terrible, right? So you're led to believe that everything dropped off for these sorry travel agents that year. But no, double that, and guess what? Guess what? You get the opposite message. So this is misguiding the readership in this tiny, tiny print that you're supposed to detect. How about this one? First, look very carefully at the y-axis, the x-axis, and who's inside that graph in that XY plot. What message do you take away from this? First off, like if I don't even look at the scales, whoa, what happened to all the Nobel Prizes awarded to United States citizens or UK citizens for that matter? Oh, they had a terrible year, right? Okay, now look more carefully and tell me what's wrong.
people are saying there's a smaller range.
Yeah, exactly. You're
Here.
talking about a decade, and huh? A few years? So what did Edward Tufte do? He expanded it to show boo, through the roof for the US. So again, the opposite message, at least in the case of the US. That is a graphic that is lying to you. Every advertisement you see is trying to bias your attention, is trying to guide you, and I'd say misguide you, exploit your perceptual modalities, either through volume, through music, some way in sound, and certainly visually. These are no different. If you look at a newspaper, if you look online, in a magazine, on a billboard, what is presented to you is trying to exploit your visual perceptual modality. Let us together attempt to discern what is a lie and what is accurate. And this is one that Edward Tufte walks through. So we'll walk through. We'll quantify what Edward Tufte called a lie factor. So you could say, oh my gosh, this image is biasing my visual perception in a certain way. But maybe we could attach a number to that. Maybe we could quantify the lie. What is a takeaway? Let's see. I don't really care what this is all about, but I see that back in 1978, it was 18. And in 1985, it's 27.5. Okay, so whatever it is, fuel economy standards for automobiles increased. What did it increase by? Well, 18 to 27.5. Well, 18 is 9 times 2, 27 is 9 times 3. So that's basically a 50% increase, a little bit more than a 50% increase. Okay. Does this highway clever graphic tell you the same accurately? Well, let's look at the width, or let's say the length of this line segment, which is the width of the highway there, versus the length of the line segment here. Is this a 50+% increase? I'm going to take my calipers, or I'll just circle this. If I take this, I have to go 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's about 8 times the length. That is not a 50% increase. That's like an 800% increase, right? So how much did the graphic designer here, maybe a freelancer for the New York Times, lie to the public? Well, let's see. As Tufte writes, this line representing 18 miles per gallon in 1978 is 0.6 inches long. Now, whatever it is, you can measure it from your screen. And then this line segment, representing 27.5 miles per the gallon, is 5.3 inches long. So this is how Tufte proposed you could quantify a lie factor. He says the lie factor is the size of the effect shown in the graphic divided by the size of the effect in the data, the actual effect, the accuracy. And what is the size of effect? The absolute value, because it could be you're getting too small or you're getting too large. So we'll equalize that by making an absolute value of the second value minus the first value over the first value. So to solve this, we'd have the magnitude of the change from 1978 to 1985 is shown in the graph by the relative lengths. So the second value in this case is that 5.3 inches. That's what the graph is showing. Minus 0.6 inches divided by 0.6 inches. So the second value minus the first value over the first value. And we can multiply that by 100 to get a percent value. And in this case, it's almost 8 times the length, or almost 800%. Now let's see what the data actually tell us. The numerical change, 53%, right? 18 to 27.5. What is the lie factor? Well, it's what graphically is represented in terms of change divided by what is accurately told to change. So 783%, when it really was only 53% increase, the lie factor is 14.8. Now this is unitless. It's not with unit because we divided percent by percent, but it gives you this number. And that number, while seemingly arbitrary, is far away from totally accurate. What would totally accurate be? Anybody want to answer in the chat really fast? What would be the perfect ratio here?
1. Everybody's saying 1.
Exactly, right? So if you tell the truth, that should be 53% graphically. So this is so far away from 1 as to be a huge lie, an egregious misrepresentation. Let's look at this one. I found this on a site that was also talking about the Tufte lie factor, and it had to do with politics. And this person pulled up a graph that they found about voters per pledged delegate for Hillary Clinton versus Barack Obama. Whoa! Hillary Clinton blew Obama out of the water. Or did she? What's the problem here? Chat.
Doesn't start at 0. Everybody.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that is painful. If you were to graph this with the y-axis starting at 0, this is what you'd get. And the difference here between these two bar graphs is only 13.2%. This is far more, right? So we could easily quantify the lie factor here by using those same factors. Going back to Tufte, but with a new challenge at hand, and I'm going to quote Friendly from 2005, the scale of the graphic should always correspond to changes in the data being represented. And look at these two graphs. These break this rule by using area to show one-dimensional data. So in the case of these barrels of crude oil from Saudi Arabia, look at the height of this one and this one, and look at the value, $2.41 to $14.55. We could say this value minus this value over that value times 100. How does that compare to what's graphically represented? And now we have to think huge barrel. So area of this minus area of that divided by area of this times 100 to get the percent. So you put the graphical representation of the difference, the change, over the actual difference. And then you can calculate the lie factor here and here. So this shrinking doctor, same idea. Now, the problem is that you've got one-dimensional or linear data represented as two-dimensional data with the area, but I'd argue it's even worse than that. See, this doctor is overlapping the other doctor. This barrel is overlapping or visually occluding part of this other barrel, which now gives us this impression that we're dealing with 3D volumetric differences, which is hard because, well, what does that mean? If a horse falls down a deep well, that horse splashes. If you drop an ant down that well, or if you flick an ant off of a tall building, what happens to that ant? The ant reaches terminal velocity more quickly because of the friction across a greater surface area relative to volume ratio. So the ant survives and walks away. So if I point a shrink ray at you and I shrink you down, your surface area is decreasing. Your volume is decreasing, but the volume decreases faster than the surface area. And conversely, if I give you a giant ray dose, and you become a giant, your volume increases more rapidly than your surface area. So your volume to surface area increases hugely. Why? Because if you're talking unidimensional data, it's just this, a line segment. But if you're talking about area, it's X times Y. If you're talking about volume, it's X times Y times Z. The volume increases cubed, while the area increases a lot, but only by a square. So volume's increasing rapidly. So our brain is now really confused when we look at these graphics because we say, whoa, area is way huger than this. And now I'm even interpreting this as a volume, right? So that compounds the problem here. All right, back to my graphic of a pie chart of described species diversity divided up in pie wedges. And how about we take a moment to quantify my lie, how much I lied. And I'd never done this before 2 days ago. And so I wanted to quantify the lie. And there are lots of ways to do this. First off, this pie chart is so outdated. It's so wrong. Like I'd want to have the different major clades of eukarya represented, et cetera. So we're going to ignore that part. And we'll look at the part that we really can test. And I'll pick one that I was most interested in. I wanted to see if the representative wedge of insect diversity by this moth, how it compares relative to the diversity of all chordates, phylum Chordata, most of which are vertebrates, animals with a vertebral column. So how do these compare? Is this fair? Well, let's try to figure it out. First, I superimpose a protractor, right? So now we see the number of degrees around this circle dedicated to insects, and the number of degrees here dedicated to chordates, mostly vertebrates. And if I gave you these rough data, the number of described species, there are about 70,000 species of vertebrates. So that's pretty much all of chordates. But there are 1.1 million described species of insects. Okay, those are the known quanta. Now, how am I graphically representing this? So the number of degrees in this pie chart, 15 degrees out of 360 for chordates, represented by the feather, and 220 degrees for the insects, represented by the moth. Your challenge, try to calculate the lie factor. Go.
Somebody, at the first value, we have 0.93.
Woo! We've got some fast calculator action there. That is That's the number I got.
Somebody said 11.
Okay, let's stop right there. So 0.93 is correct using these numbers. Now 0.93, that's pretty close to 1. Is it too far away from 1? Well, scientists out there, have you ever published, or are you planning to publish, or do you read scientific literature about p-values with an alpha value of 0.05? People are moving away from the arbitrary nature of p-values with alpha values, but that tends to be de rigueur. You have the 0.05 in terms of, so imagine a bell curve, how much of the data are represented and how much are due to random deviance from that expectation. And so typically that 0.05 value is acceptable, but sometimes for some communities, it's 0.01 or 0.001. So it tells you how arbitrary it is. But that said, that means that as long as you have a p-value of less than 0.05, maybe you're achieving something that's statistically good. Well, here, if we were to impose the same assumptions on the lie factor, we'd say 0.95 to 1.05 would be acceptable. So mine would be right on the edge there. And honestly, I thought my graphic would be a bigger lie than it turned out. So mine's kind of borderline okay if we take that arbitrary measure. Hold on, a lot of you are out there saying, but that's not enough. What about this idea that you're using a pi to begin with? Would it have been more appropriate to use one-dimensional data in the form of a bar graph? And a subset are probably saying, wait, that's not one-dimensional. Those are two-dimensional. You have X, Y. You've got a little bit of convenience. These bars could be infinitely wide, and that offers zero additional information. All it does is render these data graphically more visible. That's all. Okay, I can read this or that better than maybe a very, very thin line segment. This we decided, I think, at least I just in my head, the collective we, the me-we, that this works better than that if you're quantifying relative values, right? But I would add a very subjective additional argument that if I'd created this graphic, it would only go so far. But if I have something that, yes, has color that can bias, and yes, that's a pie chart, which is hard to read if you're comparing areas or the curvilinear line elements around the edge of the circle, if this graphic is meant to draw audiences in and evoke emotion related to known diversity of life, then maybe this is more than the bar chart. So this is where we could have a long discussion about the value of color here, of using spatial relations in a pie chart here. Ultimately, remember the big takeaway from workshop number 1, who is your audience? What information are you trying to impart? Now here in this article, Rosenberg et al. In 2023 get away at least a little bit from the pie chart in the area. I mean, this is unidimensional data too. They killed middle. Maybe that helps a little bit. And you can compare like the global biomass and number of terrestrial arthropods in this way. Then there's this classic speciescape, a gorgeous illustration by an amazing scientific illustrator, Francis Fawcett, for a long time worked for Quentin Wheeler, a professor who used to be at Cornell when I was there. And here, this is trying to show that your canvas represents different known or described species of life based on how much real estate two-dimensionally is taken up by, in this case, a lyodid representing insects, this mite representing arachnids, and this elephant catching shade under a mushroom, mammals and fungi, right? So you can go across and not all groups are represented, and some of these groupings are outdated, but it gives you that impression, wow, plants are mighty important in terms of species diversity. Insects are out over the moon, through the roof. So speciescape, just one more visual vehicle of trying to impart information about relative quantities, because you can't get absolute value. Well, they're down here. That's great. But you can get relative impressions of species diversity or species richness known across the groups. I did mention the trick with volume, and here, yes, it's even shaded. It looks three-dimensional, so that could confuse the brain and exacerbate maybe an additional dimension that's unnecessary. So we move down here, and we've got essentially silhouettes or outlines. Maybe that helps. Maybe that's less graphically misguiding. But I'd argue this one, although I love it, is less impactful than this one. Baran et al. In 2018 published this paper, The Biomass Distribution on Earth. Brilliant, beautiful, really important, valuable paper that's also one of the most sobering papers I've ever read. And it looks at distilling life into its carbon matter. So we're carbon-based life, so just take the carbon atoms and now weigh them in gigatons. How does it all compare? So you see the gigatons of carbon. So 1 cube represents 1 million metric tons of carbon, or a gigaton. So what does this tell us? A whole lot of marine arthropods. Move down, a whole lot of fish in the sea. And then we get to segmented worms, annelids, arthropods that are terrestrial, mollusks, cnidarians, livestock, huge amount of livestock, more than we weigh by far. Okay, now we're getting into the piddling stuff, weighing less than cumulative human biomass in gigatons, nematodes, and oh no, wild mammals and wild birds don't compare, aren't even close to poultry, cattle, and pigs. There's a major message there. Now we can put that in context and say, here are the gigatons of carbon represented by animals compared to plants, compared to bacteria, compared to fungi, archaeans. This is a graphic by Mark Phelan, research writing by Ghosh. Let's look at a couple of other graphics within the same article. Yes, uses pie chart. Yes, uses these odd visual charts. And obviously, you're not trying to compare in a grid, but it definitely gives you an impression, a relative impression, that arthropods and fish are the biggest numbers, or plants are the biggest numbers in this graph. Now, this was a takeaway that 100,000 years before present, look at the biomass in gigatons carbon of wild mammals. There's no livestock here, right? Compare that to today, relative to livestock and humans. This was a follow-up paper in 2023 by Greenspoon et al., where now we're looking at the global biomass of wild mammals. And you see, this is like a speciescape, just like a speciescape, along with unidimensional data showing the breakdown from marsupials to carnivores to primates. Who's the biggest among that piddling of remaining wild mammals? And again, these odd, but I find attractive and useful graphs complement that. Shall we jump to our critiquing of what you've uploaded now, or should I wrap up with a discussion of when digital doctoring is okay? Quick poll. I guess we're going digital doctoring. Ready? All right. Sometimes it's okay, sometimes it's warranted, and I'd argue even necessary. Say, for example, this guy. He asks the world through the ether web, can someone Photoshop the Eiffel Tower under my finger? Now, this meme blew up, and people responded like crazy. So yeah, they can put that Eiffel Tower under your finger, buddy. And here, of course, the magic of digital manipulation is omniimportant. There is value in digital manipulation. Historically, it goes way back, well before this National Geographic issue. But here, this was kind of a touchstone or a big turning point where National Geographic, which considered itself a source of accurate information, published a cover where the photographer admitted that he had moved one of the pyramids just to the left so it could squeeze in that iconic yellow box frame. Now, is that a problem? According to National Geographic and much of the world, it was. What could we trust if the cover was modified? Now, the photographer's defense was that if I had moved just a little bit this way, I would have gotten the same view. Interesting, right? So is it okay when moving a pyramid? How about altering anatomy? When I used to live in the Missouri Ozarks, I picked up a brochure with John Davidson, and this is what it showed. 2 left hands. All right, there's a problem here, right? And how about this? You've got the paragon of anti-slavery in Abraham Lincoln on the right. And you've got a slave-owning defender of slavery, Calhoun, on the left. Well, apparently, historically, for lack of heroic images available of Abraham Lincoln, someone took Calhoun's image and popped Lincoln's head on top of his body. The ultimate visual irony. Look at this photo. Los Angeles Times, this was published everywhere. And it was thought to be, oh my goodness, this could be a Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph. The drama there. But it was a composite of 2 other images. This one, where he's turning away apathetically, and this one where he's commanding nobody. Now make it into this powerful image, and you're lying to the public. Some of you might remember this scene where bin Laden's fortress was invaded and Barack Obama and his whole crew is watching very pensively in real time. Okay, this is a powerful photo. Would you modify it at all? Or do you tell the truth by publishing it as it is? Well, at least one Hasidic paper extracted the women. Now, this is so egregious, so misguided, based on spiritual principles. Is that worth telling a lie? Now, how about this one? So on the right is the original image of a Reuters photograph showing the remnants of an Israeli bombing. And I bet almost everybody out there can tell me what happened with this image. Chat! What did they do to make it look bigger and more devastatingly smoky?
Clone stamping, stamp clone.
Oh yeah, clone stamping. Look at that. Whoop, whoop, whoop. That redundancy, that visual repetition, a little bit smarter and more visually savvy than we were when this was published. But some errors, some manipulations are just as easily uncovered. So in The Ethics of Digital Manipulation in Scientific Images by Hayden in 2000, Hayden presents 4 items that he calls the rationale for manipulating images. What are the reasons behind manipulating an image? Number 1, to adjust the image to closely match the original subject. Okay, that makes some sense to me. Maybe you created or took an image that deviates, it's too dark, and so you just need to change the exposure, for example. That sounds fine to me. 2, to remove artifacts. Okay, possibly. Maybe you're taking a tissue culture and maybe you're taking a microscopy image and there's some dust there or something in the way. Well, careful how you remove that if you distort the information. 3, to enhance some detail of the image. Ooh, okay. There's a lot of wiggle room here to enhance some detail of the image. So does that mean you're biasing the viewer to look at one component? Okay. That bias could play out honestly or dishonestly. And that's where number 4 comes into play, to falsify the information. Now, according to Hayden, with this figure 1, this is an acceptable manipulation. Generally includes global adjustments made to the entire image for clarity. Here is a horrendous example of scientific misconduct where Huang was publishing on stem cell biology. And here was a Nobel laureate in the making who had a disastrous, precipitous fall from grace as his work was shown to be products of repetition, misconduct in a number of ways. So above, look at this, nothing, negative result, unless you change the brightness contrast and you see, wait, there's stuff in there, and look, repetition. Use the exact same image. You can't do worse in science or to science than this kind of misconduct. So a number of articles have been published that have tried to say, here are different ways that you can detect these manipulations. Say these missing bands due to brightness contrast changes, or maybe they were cut out, deleted areas, or look at this. They plopped one image with another, and you can detect that just by changing the universal contrast. So the articles include detection technology, so forensic software in an arms race of trying to detect, just as we see in artificial intelligence, writing, ChatGPT, detective measures. The same occurs with visuals as well. So one message we can take away potentially is, in short, any digital technique that isn't applied to the entire image is suspect and needs to be explicated to the reader. Sounds like a good rule. Sounds like a good law. But I'm going to show you where I personally broke that to end on this slide. So above is an image of a honeybee. And she's sleeping. She's drooping in the direction of gravity, discontinuously ventilating. Her response threshold is high. And I took this photo with an infrared camera, a security camera. And below this image is a honeycomb. And I'm trying to show, here's one worker honeybee inserted inside a honeycomb cell, and she's sleeping too. Well, the images are somewhat clear, but they're not telling the story that I needed to tell for the publication. So what did I do? I changed the brightness contrast so that the background ends up being visually less important. So it highlights, okay, I'm looking at this individual, I'm looking at this individual. Ignore the rest, but you see you get an impression of the context. Moreover, I say I individually paint mark the bees. I put a little ferrous metal that I glued to the back of the bee and painted that. And if you look at a bee inserted in a cell, if she's sleeping, you can see certain movements in the tip of the abdomen. So I'm telling a larger story there. As long as I responsibly alert the reader in the figure legend how I've changed the image, then I should feel okay, right? I haven't lied to the public. I've told a story using vehicles that augment and you could say exploit or bias, but harness the readership's visual perceptual biases. Now, let's go to critiquing. Well, where do we start? How about backwards? Okay. I hope all of us know that this is a baffle failure. This is an artificial intelligence meme-worthy disaster. So someone created this just with a few words in a visual AI program, and it is so far off the mark in text. I mean, everything's meaningless in text, visually, and this tells us what kind of world we're in, not that we're going to be in, but we're in already, and how carefully we have to navigate as visual consumers and visual producers. So don't willy-nilly, without safeguards, use AI to produce your visuals. And don't assume the visuals you're seeing are truth unless you seek veracity. This person says, sex age categories of Western giant eland guide, the morphology and development of blah, 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 blah. So one way this is, now granted the resolution's off and everything, but one way this is really helpful is just as in really good field guides, if you have side-by-side comparisons, you can gauge the differences, the discrepancies, the species-specific salient traits. Oh, good, we've got a poster. And we've got a poster uploaded by my twin brother, Arno Klein. Arno, this is exquisite. Borderline perfection. Do I get a holiday present? Well done. So let's think about it critically. Yes, this is visually engaging. Arno always does exquisite info visuals. One thing that we could address is the amount of text. So for example, if Arno is standing by this poster, he would be able to elucidate the background information. He would be able to regale you with the maximizing discriminability factors. He would be able to point and tell you about all the intricacies and the nuances in these brain color maps. The text probably here and there could be minimized. Maybe at times we don't need full sentences, for example. Some of the text is very small, like this. Now, if it's blown up to be a poster, let's hope that's legible. Whatever is not legible, including within the figures, you want to eliminate, streamline, right? But I think the poster flows nicely. I think it would attract you from across the room. And I think you know how to travel or navigate through this poster. And having Arno there would be a delight as well as an asset in guiding you. Ah, interesting. Okay, here we're saying problematic graphic from Sarah Miller. She uploaded this with, oh, we go from beautiful brains to that brain. Now, there are a number of issues with this, and I can see why this was labeled problematic. One is, if I want to find the icon that represents or symbolizes the organ, I'm at a loss in part because of this inverse coloration. So I can't look for a red heart if it's white here on red. That adds a level of difficulty that's unnecessary. Why not make it a red heart on white? And then I say, oh, there it is. You know, something like that. Okay, then I can find it more easily. The rest is probably problematic just in terms of subjective measures, aesthetics. Wow, this is gorgeous. Okay, this is a beautiful Cnidarian visual, obviously produced by a professional and National Geographic illustrator. Now, even this one, we could think about in terms of, as always, who is our audience? What message do we wish to convey? Is this a success? And I think for a general audience that curious about nature, attracted to this, it succeeds in many ways. Do we need that amount of text? Depends. There's no one there to point you along and guide you, so maybe having that text really helps. Now, much of our audience is probably irked by the non-metric inches and feet. What does that even mean? So you lose some of your audience just based on the 120-foot long. We know it's big because we've got this diver, although who is that diver? Is it a 5-foot or 6'4" long diver? We don't know. It's really nice to have it's called a family tree, but it's actually the ordinal tree or phylum level tree, because we're looking at Cnidaria. So to a biologist, that's a little misleading, but it's a colloquialism, common use family tree, like a pedigree. And then you've got life stages, or the making of a medusa, from polyp to medusa. That's really nice. So you've got lots of information in this one graphic, which is lovely. Wow, I'll try not to be too biased here, but what's going on? So we've got, first, resolution's really low. I hope it was published at higher resolution. But even if it were, look at these visuals. Yikes. I don't know what any of them are doing. I guess that's an infant, and you're looking from parent's view, and they're doing something, and they're doing child's eye view, doing something. So that's trouble. The images are just kind of willy-nilly placed, scattered about with really pixelated black arrows, and then yellow. Well, first you have the red-green on the same graph, so you lose some of your audience there. Yellow will be very hard to reproduce as well as to see for many people. So there are a lot of problems here. Thankfully, the scales are the same, so you can match those up. But otherwise, there are ways this could be improved. You probably don't need the top part of this graph, or maybe even the right part of the graph. So a lot I would believe needs to change here. All right, okay. Schematic display. We're looking over time. So this is telling a fairly clear story with very minimal words, which makes it somewhat successful. And there is a pipe that's, I'm told, is not a pipe. So there you have that. Thank you, Magritte. Benefits of algae. Nice. I like the aesthetic here. But here's one where, aside from the resolution, we can ask what's necessary here. And I don't know what all of this is on the bottom, but I'm guessing it could probably go. I don't know why it's cobalt blue on this color, this peach color. Maybe it doesn't need any color. The color is superfluous. I would personally change the typeface, but that's just my choice. The scale is very fine where it doesn't need to be, probably. Could probably just have the hash marks at 0.51, 1.52, depending on what information you're trying to convey. Okay, so this is obviously not a science visualization, but we can use our more generalizable lessons here. We say, okay, there are there are several, like you have one hue here with two brightness or saturation levels, right? And then you've got your black. And then you could ask, is it being used effectively? Does the black send one message? Does the red versus the pink send another message? And is this an optimal layout as well as density of information? Is all of this necessary, for example? Is it easy to navigate? What do these forms actually mean? Oh, this must be a geographic thing? Northland. So I guess this is a geographically meaningful shape. Okay, that's kind of cool. Drug A, B, C. Well, I've decided I'm not going to take any one of them, A, B, or C. Why? Because I'm dealing with one-dimensional data on a three-dimensional graph that I can't even read. I don't know the height of this versus that on this twisted graph. So it's very complicated. Having the gray background doesn't help. Having the three-dimensionality is misguided. There are no units for the dose. There are a lot of problems with this graph. Go 2D instead of 3D unless 3D is warranted. Especially if you can't even compare the data. Whoa. Adorable. Chat, what's the problem with this graph?
Intentionally misleading, doesn't start from 0.
Well, it is from Fox. That's true. So it doesn't start at 0. That's a huge error. Well, this is really nice. This is an elegant series of illustrations. And with the universal dashed lines showing something that's behind or occluded by what's in the foreground. You have efficient, delicate shading. Yeah, these are really elegant. Gun deaths in Florida. Number of murders committed using firearms. Okay, name top problem with this. Chat.
Inverted scale.
Horribly confusing. To start with 0 at the zenith, the apex, and go down to 1,000? So are we to read the blood red, or are we to read the white? We're tempted to go where it's dark and colorful, and yet we're used to reading graphs where it starts with 0 at the bottom on the y-axis. So now, how do you read this 873 being higher than this 721? Way too confusing. Same here. Blood dripping down, but that's not how you're to read this graph. Option 1, we jump into our discussion groups and look at your own creations together, happily, constructively, critically for at least a little bit. Or option 2, I work through more critical examples. Or option 3, question and answer session. Or option 4, I give you a tour of Hive helmets on my head. 1 through 4, go. It's a dead heat.
It's evenly split.
Well, how about this? I'll show you 2 helmets and then we'll do the critiques. Oh, I know. How about, yeah, 2 Hive helmets, critiques, and then Q&A. Does that sound good? All right. Okay. Okay, great. Let's see. Well, last time I showed you this one where I put a recycled bicycle helmet inside my honeybee hive and they built comb on it. And then I decided to do paper mache below. So that's hive helmet number 1. number 2. Comes with wings. Like that. Dun, dun, dun. And then hive helmet number 3.
So Baird, while you're showing the helmet, somebody in the chat is asking if we can rate your helmets.
All right. I don't have all my hive helmets here, but we'll go with these
We can
3.
do that next time, some images and then like option numbers, and we can set that up.
Okay, so option 1, that guy. Option 2 with the wings. And option 3, this is a wacky one. Ready? Dun, 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 dun. So this is sculpted eggs, larvae, and pupae on the beehive helmet, and then coins representing honeybees from 4 different countries on the planet are swarming around. Let's see if any of these show up. See that honeybee? Yes. Hive helmets. Is, is there a winner?
Hold on.
Meanwhile, I'll jump to critiquing as that poll comes up. Well, this is different enough. Let's see what this is all about. Cities with best batting averages. So this is an info visual, not a scientific graphic, but let's see. The first way I read this is across these cities from Sydney, Australia to Mumbai, India, we've got numbers of runs. Now, the sci-viz person in me is immediately going to ask, okay, is it height that matters here? Is it area that matters here? What message is being told? Well, it's not height because this is the biggest number of runs and the biggest average. So Sydney's off to the left and it's the shortest and kind of the smallest, and yet it's supposed to represent the biggest. So this is not the way that I would put the visual together, because I'd want to have it in an order. And, you know, typically it's culturally driven as well, but many people are biased to read left to right with a progression or an increase. So I'd almost expect in this case, Mumbai's the winner. But is it? It's not, right? In this case, it's right in the middle. Versus Sydney off to the left, looking small and short. So I'd call this an ineffective graphic. I don't even know what the order is really. Also, I don't know why there's this sweeping red or why the colors are the way they are. High drama?
It looks like they ordered it by building size,
Right, building size.
which
By
has
building-
nothing to do with the actual data they're
Yeah.
representing.
Very strange. How about, well, this has a cicada, so of course I'm going to pull that up. Oh yes, so I even wrote about this. So on a species of cicada called the clanger cicada, if you look very carefully at the surface of the front wing, it has little what are called pillars, nanopillars, and bacteria that attach eventually kind of droop in the middle and are either pierced or lose their water in some way. they tend not to survive. So this ends up being a really great passive mechanism as an antibacterial surface agent, and something that we can learn from in surfaces we create on medical probes, etc. But what am I doing? It's like I created this image or something like that. I know enough about the background that I'm describing it. I should start by stepping back and saying, what can we learn from the visual itself? Oh, I see the hive helmet with wings is the winner. And the swarm, sadly, of coins fails to make either first or second place. Thanks, everybody. That's fun to see. All right, while I'm going through more of these, 1 in 8 bird species threatened with extinction. Okay. Well, I guess one problem with this graphic. Well, first, I don't know what this represents. Extinct? I guess extinct. Doesn't say extinct. But I'm going to assume, I'm not sure what that is. And that's a problem. Area, comparing across areas, as we know, is difficult. Is this again 14 times the amount? Is that represented numerically? Colors, I can see why the colors make sense from green, which we're surrounded by in our world of green, so it's less aposematic until you get to this warning coloration. Okay, we're going to personal works now. I see it now in this poll. Oh, wow. Oh, we've got a lot of great stuff. Goodness. Hey, I recognize. I bet the same person who did the skull we looked at before. Maybe. Hey, this is beautifully done. A triumph. So if we want to think about this critically, how would I assess this? Well, one, I think the aesthetics are beautiful. I think the person did a really good job thinking about the lighting, directionality of the lighting. We've got the darker areas here, the lightest areas here. So I assume the light is coming off from the right and above. We can see that it's not perfectly accurate. Like, look at the wiggles here, those sutures here versus here. How accurate do you want it to be? Look at this erratic. I mean, this is separating, right? All along here. And you show that, but not as much here, right? So we could strive for greater accuracy, attention to detail. And we could think about putting a scale bar, because you probably won't be gluing the bobcat skull to the piece of paper. So you want some scale bar to show us how big that is. Unless you're hanging it above your mantle and its actual size as it appears to be, and that's sufficient. You might also consider parenthetically including the genus and species epithet. Very nice. And it's really pleasant on the paper background it's on. Okay. Oh. Interesting. White-tailed deer. And we see this is italicized, so that's good. Inches. Hey, scientists, go metric, right? So let's have our centimeters there instead of inches. This is a beautiful work. Really tremendous, beautiful work. You might consider, and this is purely aesthetically minded and subjective, but do you want greater contrast in certain areas where it is darkest? Do you want to have like almost black line here, right? I really like it. And I see, it'd be interesting to see this side by side with the white-tailed deer skull. So we could look for accuracy as well. Very nicely done. here is an example where if you did not, Davidson, if you did not create this visual, and maybe you did, just be cautious. And I'll say just generally watch out for not only creating AI stuff, but taking clip art or bio render, ... Just always check for accuracy. The aesthetic here is really beautiful. I like the layout, and it's clear what each part represents. Like here's the CO2 going through the stomata on the undersides of the leaf of this plant. I'm not sure how to link plant height with this image unless each of these represent one of these plants. And if each of these is to represent one of these plants, I'd make that look more like this plant. Great. Okay. A lot to talk about here. Danuka or Danuka, Dilshan, thank you for contributing this. Let's take a look at it. So overall, very nice. Really interesting components. We're looking at evolution of butterflies. This is a huge topic. So how do you tackle that? Well, it's nice to see that there's a fossil there with an eye spot and an extant organism with an eye spot. I see you're pointing out the anatomy of the butterfly. We have to ask, though, what of all of this information is essential? First off, where is this going? Is this a page of a book? Is it a poster? Is it a pamphlet? Is it a slide for a show? Is it something that someone can sit with for an hour? Or is it something someone looks at for 12 seconds? There's a lot of text. The color coding, and again, this is purely subjective, but why not go with the monarch color? This is the one you're highlighting. This is where all eyes go. So why not make butterflies that deep orange and the underlining part a light orange, something like that. You know, and then the text could follow in turn if you have to color the text, because you already have this larger, right? So think in terms of hierarchy of information. How large will this scale up or down? I can't read this, and unless this is a big poster or on the side of a wall, I'd be really wary of what's in here, right? It's probably all really valuable. You've got geological time scale and stuff, but I can't make out the icons representing the different groups. And are these even necessary? Do I need to point out the anatomy, or is that just distracting? Do I really refer to these features in a way that's meaningful enough to include the anatomical features being highlighted? If I could see this more closely, let's see what we've got. Too blurry. Got to get rid of this. If it's not legible, blown up, if it pixelates like this, you've got to either find a higher resolution version of it or delete it. For all of this information references, maybe you could just have Havid 2020 and then the link or something like that, or a DOI. Also low resolution if you want it to be big enough to make this meaningful. So you've got a lot of information here. You've got to have it all scalable or all at the same scale. Very nice. Oh, it's beautiful. Maybe watercolor or gouache on a textured paper. Oh, that's great. Oh, this is Yeah, this is lovely. Yeah, my only comment, I only have 2 comments here because this is an exquisite work. I want to know who created this. Please send me a message. This is beautiful. Maybe the negative space is a little excessive. Maybe we could pull this up more, at least a little bit. Also, everything is italicized, which would be fine, except that you've got a species name, which is supposed to be italicized. And there's a convention that if everything's in italics, then what should be in italics, namely a genus and species epithet, is then now regular. I don't like that convention. I just think the scientific name should be italicized or separately underlined. Beautiful work. I can't comment. I think this is a cultural component. Yeah, maybe this should be larger. And I'm assuming this comes with a figure legend with greater explanation, but this is a gorgeous composite.
So Sandra Isabel Puente Figueroa, I apologize if I mispronounced your name, said that that was hers.
Oh my goodness. Well, send me an email. I want to talk to you. Jesse Smith, I could detect this from a mile away.
Okay,
From
I think
somewhere
Barrett,
far.
this will have to be our last one.
What? Oh my gosh.
I'm sorry.
But what about this one with the arbitrary coloration and the 2-dimensional issues? And all right, this is a great place to end because it's a glorious Bembidion genus carabid beetle as belt buckle. And we haven't spent a lot of time today talking about non-2D works. Here's a 3-dimensional triumph where you've got not only accuracy, but an aesthetically compelling 3-dimensional rendering of an actual beetle. Beautifully done. And on top of that, like the hive helmets, but even more than the hive helmets, this is a wearable piece of art, as well as something that can elicit as outreach or educational tool interest in the glorious insects. I've had a blast today. And if we do have time, we could do questions and answers. If we don't, maybe I could look over the chats and address the questions and answers in the future installment.
Great. And we can also send you the unanswered Q&A. And maybe if you have time to answer it, we can post your answers in the lobby.
Yeah, that'd be great.